Okay, so you are right to come in. So we're recording now. Just want to say a massive thank you and welcome to Professor Amy Smith from Reading Uni, who has come in to talk to us today about the Parthenon and the Great Panathenaia, which is of course really relevant to both A-level in terms of Greek art and Greek religion, but also GCSE, classical civilization as well. So we hope that anybody who is going to be watching this via our YouTube channel will also find it immensely useful. So thank you so much for coming to join us today. The students are very, very excited. And I'll turn my camera off and hand over to you.
Okay, brilliant. And thank you for the invitation. And I'm sorry in a way not to be on your beautiful campus, but frankly, in the middle of my teaching schedule this term down in Reading, which is a long way away from you, it's brilliant that I can come to you via Teams. So for both those of you in person and those of you who might access this online, yeah, it's great to be virtually at Runshaw Academy. So I've come to talk to you about both the Parthenon and the Great Panathenaia, and many of you will have read a little bit about both of them, but maybe not so much, talked about what brings them together. Of course, they're both super important and brought together by the goddess who, frankly, is my favorite Greek goddess, the goddess of wisdom and technology and much else, Athena, who you see standing on the opening slide here. This is a reconstruction of the great chryselephantine, which means gold and ivory, statue of Athena Parthenos that stood about, as the sources say, 40 cubits high, so maybe 40 feet or so, in the middle of the Parthenon itself. And this is what the inside of the Parthenon might have looked like. You can kind of tell from the little Lego figures, or well, whatever they are in the lower right corner, that it's a mock-up. It's not the real thing. The real thing isn't there. And 2,500 years ago, if you had a statue made or plated with gold and ivory, you better believe that someone else would have made good use of that gold and ivory and taken it down in the intervening time. So I'm just going to give you a little overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, the Panathenaia, the great festival to Athena. Talk about what it was, how it was evidenced, that is to say, how do we know about it? And a little bit about Athena on the Acropolis, which is the high point of Athens. It literally means high city. And then the Parthenon, one of the many buildings on the Acropolis, but possibly the most important because it was the great temple for Athena in Athens. And a little bit about the architecture, how it blends both Ionic and Doric styles in Greek temple architecture, but also what its purpose was and how, if at all, it relates to the Panathenaia. So just to situate ourselves, we're in Greece, and I hope those of you studying classics have a pretty good idea of what Greece is. This is Greece, both now and in antiquity, I suppose. The names of the places are still there. So you've got the hand-like bit, the Peloponnese, which is sort of falling down into the Aegean Sea. You've got all these nice islands all over the Aegean Sea. And in the mainland, there's this peninsula coming off of the mainland to the right, which is Athens region, the region around Athens called Attica, and Athens is the city at the center of that. I'm also going to take you briefly to Ephesus, which is in what's nowadays Turkey, what in antiquity, well, this landmass called Asia Minor, but there were Greeks living on the west coast of Turkey, also in Samos, which is an island off of Turkey, and briefly up to Corfu, this because of examples of temple architecture that I'm going to be mentioning, and also Olympia, the great sanctuary where Zeus is the head god, but also where they had athletic events, the foundation of the Olympic Games and all that. And when all archaeologists or ancient historians talk about chronology, we mean dates. Chronology is just a fancy way of saying the study of time. And remember, counting backwards, this is BC or BCE, if you want to put it that way. So the dates, run from an older date to a newer date. The archaic period, what the Greeks mean, old style. They refer to old style art, for example, from that period, is before the Persian Wars. And so that's up from 700 down to about 480. And it's also in terms of art when, monumental stone sculpture developed and other developments in the naturalistic representation of the human figure, like that beautiful statue of Athena I showed you. But then the classical period to which that statue actually belongs, it's also defined politically from the rise of the political supremacy of Athens when they had their empire, essentially, and their golden age of art and all sorts of other things that come with empire up until the expansion of Greece under Alexander the Great. And in fact, that finishing point of the so-called classical period, 323, is the death of Alexander the Great. I talked briefly about Athena, and here, albeit without the accents, are from left to right, the Greek name, the transliteration in Greek, the transliteration in Latin, and then the English translation of temples and festivals of Athena. These are just a few, actually, but the Panathenaia is the big festival I'll be talking today. It's where all the Athenians get together. And of course, it's a little bit confusing because Athena and Athenian are, well, the same word essentially, because she gave her name essentially to Athens. And that's part and parcel for being the patron goddess of Athens. But just to say, that wasn't the only place or the only time that she was worshipped in a great festival where everyone got together, gave sacrifices and all that. And in the Athenian calendar, at least, and I should caution here, different Greek cities in antiquity, they worked different ways. They had different dialects of the language. They had different calendars. They had different gods who they worshipped, etc. But mostly all in common, just like different variations. Anyway, in Athens, at least, they calendar Hecatombion was their month. They had a 12-month calendar, but it's offset from ours. And so actually, Hecatombion is early in the year in the Greek sense, and her birthday, and it corresponds to our early August. And so that would have been her birthday, and that was when they had the Panathenaia. And they had it every year, but once every 4 years, they had the Great Panathenaia when they made a bigger deal about it. And all the Athenians, all except the slaves, participated, and they all processed up to the Acropolis, which, as I said, is the high point of Athens, and that's where the Parthenon is. And they sacrificed 100 oxen, which is actually an awful lot of effort and a lot of, blood and gore and obviously some animal excrement and things like that. So it's really an impressive thing to be able to accomplish all of that on what is really a tiny bit of space. And in fact, Jeremy McInerney, a scholar from the States, has University of Pennsylvania. He's recently done some really interesting work on how, the physical evidence on the Acropolis of how this sacrifice worked. That's not what I'm here to talk to you about today, but it is an important part of any festival, really. For the vegans, I should say, they did have sort of vegan vegetarian festivals, like Apollo was associated with the harvest, and so bean soup or something like that might have been the thing they had for that. But one thing that makes a great Panathenaia, which, as I say, is once every 4 years, really important, is it's when they had the presentation of the peplos of Athena. And the peplos is this lovely garment that she's wearing. You see, and this is the reconstruction again I showed you. This is, by the way, by a sculptor called Alan Lequire, and it's in the Nashville Parthenon, which is obviously in the United States. I've never been there. I think they established it in 1990. So, but they did it on the basis of a lot of good academic work on what a lost statue might have looked like, which is preserved in some later, copies and paintings and things like that. Anyway, so she's wearing this beautiful robe, not different from what a lot of Greek goddesses and young women would have worn. It's fastened at her shoulders and belted at her waist, etc. And because one of the many things that you see on the Parthenon frieze, and I'll show you where that fits on the Parthenon itself, is this interesting scene of basically what looks like a man and a child, maybe a boy, maybe a girl. People like to debate about that one, folding up this huge piece of cloth, and that could well be the peplos, which is essentially a big piece of cloth that the little girls would weave in Athens, and then it would be presented a new robe to her, essentially once every 4 years at the Great Panathenaia. And just to show you how the robe sort of works, we've got this model pinning it up on over both shoulders, and then the belt going around. She's trying to make it a little more sexy, but Athena is well covered, as you can see. And so the Great Panathenaia was reorganized. They had athletic events in association with it, and musical events too, and they were reorganized according to the written sources by the tyrant Pisistratus in 566 BC. It happened before another set of games, the Pythian games. Those were up at Delphi, one of the great Pan-Hellenic centers where all the Greeks got together, like the Olympic Games, only the Pythian games were at a different sanctuary. And so it was kind of like a prelude for, getting ready for the big game somewhere else at first. But it gradually became international in its own right, attracting athletes from all over the Greek world to come to Athens. And as I say, they had contests. They had some local contests or tribal contests, because the Athenian populace was divided into a bunch of different tribes, such as torch race. And we have nice images on some of the Athenian pots from the times that show people connected with the torch races. See the chap with a spiky helmet here, he's holding a torch, and then a guy here with a torch. And it looks a little bit like some sort of relay race. And in fact, we have a modern version of that incorporated into the Olympic Games, that a torch is brought to wherever the Olympics are going to be in anticipation of the Olympic Games. Maybe you're not old enough to remember, but I still remember when we had it in 2012 in England, and the torch went all over the country. Actually, came to my local town. We have also some athletic races. These are sort of quasi-athletic military races, because it's a special contest called the Apobates, where you can see on both of the images here, both sculpture and on a vase painting, a four-horse chariot and the charioteer, dealing with the horses. But then this other guy who's jumping on and off of the chariot, fully armed, which is really, really hard work. And so that's what makes it kind of an athletic thing. And it gets us back to why the Greeks are so big on athletics. Well, it was a way of practicing for military activity. And this Apobates race is a very good indication of that. It's not just riding a chariot, but jumping on and off of it when it's at full speed while you're carrying all your armor. I can't imagine doing that, really. They also have a boat race, and I'm afraid I don't have any images of that. That's one that we're told about in some of the literary sources, but it's hard to find images of it in the art of Athens. And also, another thing we have on some of their painted pots from the time, what looks a little bit like target practice, but javelin throwing from horseback. And you can see these guys doing that quite efficiently. But they also had dancing. And so I'm showing you here a famous relief called the Atarbos relief. It's because the inscription in the lower right here says it was dedicated by this chap called Atarbos, who was a Choregos, a guy who set up some of the dramatic events in Athens in the 4th century, actually. And but it shows some very nice images of both women and men who seem to be doing sort of choral dancing, or dancing in circles. Obviously, they're not in a circle on a rectangular base, but it might be a representation of people who would have been dancing, so to speak, in circles. But they also had music contests. And so again, we can see in the visuals, this lovely vase on the lower left, a man playing a double aulos. And we know from some of the literary sources, but we've also found archaeologically, just to the, I guess, right as you look at it, of the great theater of Dionysus. Here's the theater of Dionysus in the background. There's a great hall, a big rectangular hall that was called the Odeon. And that literally is the place where you go hear things, actually. And in fact, Odeon is sometimes something, a name associated with theatrical places, even in London nowadays. But these are musical contests, so it's more about hearing people than seeing people. And we have a contest of the Kitharoidoi, who are people who play a sort of a precursor of the guitar, and they play the music, but they also do it with voice. And we have singers who are accompanied by the aulos. This is this chap with a double flute. What's more of an oboe kind of sound, called the aulatress, actually. But then we've got the sporting events, and it's, again, kind of like the Olympics. We have races on foot, running, combat sports, horse racing. And very importantly for us, in terms of looking at the evidence of the Panathenaia, we have these prizes given for the athletic events. A big amphora, which literally means it's a vessel that's held from both sides. And that means we've got two handles. See one handle on the other side. And it was presented with 40 liters of oil, olive oil, which is really, really huge amount of oil. In antiquity, they probably did even more with olive oil than we do. We like to cook with it. It's very healthy for you. But they also would have used it for lamp oil and probably shining their leather and their weapons and things like that. And these special Panathenaic amphora, that's a special shape. They're very bulbous, and they've got rather small handles and very, pointed feet and everything. But they are decorated on one side, as you've seen, with the athletic event for which presumably they were given in honor, and on the other side with the statue image, an image of the statue of Athena. This is Athena Promachos, and Promachos means ready for war. And this seems to imitate or be a depiction of a famous statue that was in the middle of the Acropolis, right in the middle of the Acropolis. And then very usefully for us, it says in an inscription down the sides, for the Athenian Games. So we know explicitly that those are the pots associated with the Panathenaic athletics. But often, not this one, but often they'll have a sign on the other side, and it says, in the archonship of someone or other. And that's really important because in Athens, they had this thing called archon, which meant sort of leader, like mayor or king, king for a year kind of thing, the leader of Athens for a year. And so if we see that that's the archonship of someone called James, then we just look on the archon list that we have, thankfully, in another source, and we realize that James was the archon in, whatever time of the year, or sorry, whatever time it was, maybe 566. This one would be much later, but you get the idea. And so we have a very explicit and secure way of dating these pots. Otherwise, how would we know exactly what time each of them were, made, and which contest they were for? But they're not the only prizes, because for the musicians, they got money as a prize, and the traditional sports, they got a cow as a prize, which reminds us that actually Greece at this time, and for a long time, has been an agrarian community. I'm sorry about the sound of crying. My neighbor is crying, obviously, next door, and I wish I could shut her up. But if any of you have small brothers or sisters, once a child starts going, there's nothing you can do about it. I can't say, sorry, I'm in a presentation, be quiet. So we'll just have to deal with that. But this takes us a little bit to the Acropolis and the Parthenon. And actually what we're looking at here with some of the cuttings in the foreground is maybe some of the stuff that would have been associated with the great sacrifice of those oxen. But we are looking at the northeast side of the Parthenon itself. Unfortunately, it's been blown up and battered over the last 2,500 years. Some of it's been reconstructed. This is an old picture. More of it's been reconstructed since then. And there's always cranes up on that site. And this is the building in which that statue of Athena Parthenos would have been. So I'll talk a little bit about it. That actually is a view of the same building from the top. And this is the Acropolis, this piece of rock that's obviously been flattened a little bit and paved and got other buildings on it. And I just want to, while looking at that view, I want to show you there's several places on this high point of Athens. This is in the middle of Athens. If you visit Athens and look up, you'll see it there, poking through all the other buildings because it's quite tall. But we have, for some reason, my slide's not advancing here. Sorry, do you see anything changing? I'm going to.
No, not at the moment. Is it?
I'm going to end my show for a second, and then I'm going to start it again, if you don't mind. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. And don't worry, we can't hear any sound as well from neighbors.
Oh, okay, good.
You're all good.
Not worried about that. Okay. Yeah, so if I share the presentation again, I don't know why that would have. Okay, do you see it again? We're back at the beginning.
Yeah, it's not on full screen, but we can see the little smiley faces. There we go, it's on full screen now. So if we try and advance.
There's one smiley face.
It's working, it's working. Thank you.
Okay, good. So this smiley face is for Athena Polias, which is an older city of Athena that was destroyed by the Persians. And so we don't have it anymore, but it's between the Erechtheion, which is later building, and the Parthenon right here. So maybe the Parthenon was put here right next to the Temple of Athena Polias on purpose. And Polias means of the city. So that's Athena, the city goddess, essentially. She got like a different nickname or surname. We call it epithet, comes after it. So Athena Parthenos actually means Athena the Virgin, and she's the one who's honored and celebrated in the temple preceding the Parthenon. And the whole idea of her being a virgin goddess is she's sort of, she's not connected to any man except for her father Zeus. And so in a sense, maybe that concentrates a little more of his, dare I say, masculine power. And that was kind of important to the Greeks because they were a bit misogynistic. They didn't really like women. So it was a way of dealing with the fact that this was a goddess who was so powerful and so wise, the goddess of wisdom. We've also got, and the smiley face is approximately where there was a freestanding statue of Athena, again, a giant statue, Athena Promachos. That's the one I showed you on the Panathenaia amphorae, and that's Athena ready for war. That's literally what it means. And that's in the Acropolis sanctuary in the center, where if you just go through the little gate, which is right behind it on your way in, that's kind of the first thing you're going to see. And then finally, and that's an image of it, sorry, just a reminder of this statue, which was by Phidias, who actually was the same sculptor, craftsman, who was the overseer of the Parthenon building project, but he also did this amazing statue of Athena, as I say, ready for war. She's got her shield, she's got her spear, ready to go, and she's wearing her helmet as usual. And finally, the latest one was Athenonike, which is Athena of the victory. And now if you have Nike or Nike sneakers, you know that they're named for victory, and that's what the swoosh is, actually. And that's a tiny little temple. Again, it's the first thing you see when you go up the stairs of the Acropolis, and that's celebrating her as a goddess who brought them to victory in war, for example, in the Peloponnesian Wars. And this is a front view, again, of a reconstruction of the sanctuary. So you've got the Propylaea, which is the gateway that you walk through on your way. And then after you've gone through, then you've got the statue of Athena, which actually is just appearing over the top of the roof here, but you wouldn't have really seen it until you went through the gateway. And then you have the Parthenon itself. And we know from building records, it was started in 447 and finished in 432. The Erechtheion, a later temple from about 421, which was a sanctuary of many, many gods, maybe 18 of them. And then this tiny little temple at the front called the Temple of Athenonike, which is about the same time as the Erechtheion. And this is what it looks like nowadays. And it is a steep ramp, and it was even steeper in antiquity because now they have a switchback with the stairs going back and forth. But that makes it that much more impressive that they would have had a huge procession going up there, again with 100 oxen that they were going to sacrifice up there. And this is just turning back as you're going through the gateway, and you can see actually the harbor, Piraeus. If anyone's ever taken a boat into Athens, that's where you would have taken it into. It's quite a distance away. But again, because this is a high point of the city, you can see that far, well, on a good day. And so then once you're inside the gateway, then you approach the Parthenon, actually from the back. This is the west end of the Parthenon, which, as in our churches today, is usually the back end, and the east end is the front end. And that's maybe where you would have seen the gods or would have been facing the gods. And it's important for Athena, actually, because she was born at dawn. And if you think about it, facing east is facing dawn. And so you're facing her birthplace at the very beginning of the day, and that's kind of a special place to approach from. Now I'm going to briefly introduce you to the difference between the Doric and the Ionic orders. They're basically two of the many classes of or categories of architecture styles in ancient Greece and Rome, but at this time pretty much the only choices were Doric and Ionic. And the Doric is frankly the simpler one, where you've got a simple shaft of there's many columns here, but this is a shaft of stone that's a column that goes flat into the stylobate, or that's sort of the stairway or the flat floor beneath you, and then it has a very sort of flat, cushiony sort of capital on top. And then the architrave is the bit that is the stone that goes across all the columns and then holds the ceiling, the roof, excuse me. And between the roof and the architrave is a decorative frieze. And the decorative frieze in the Doric order is made up of these square elements called metopes between these sort of striated elements, basically 3 lines sculpted into the stone that are called triglyphs. And those alternate so that you can get different scenes if you decorate them. Some were decorated in clay, some were decorated in paint, some were decorated in stone, as on the Parthenon, with sculptures. And if you decorate them, then you can have sort of a bunch of different scenes, kind of like a cartoon. But in the Ionic order, you have a continuous frieze, so you have figures just keep going on and on and on, and that's very good for processions. And the Ionic order also different because you've got these sort of curly Q capitals called volute capitals, which are, look fancier, and also fancier bases where you've got a bunch of rings going up and down, back and forth. And so, yeah, just showing you the decorative spaces. I've got my figure in the metope, single figure, and then the frieze for the Ionic order, it just is continuous. Figures keep going right across. And if I go back into the history of the architectural orders, well, the Ionic order is called Ionic because it comes from Ionia, which is the region of East Greece on what's now the west coast of Turkey, and also the islands near there like Samos. And if we go back to 560 BC, there's evidence of a temple to Hera that was an Ionic temple, and we know that because we've got a capital here that's preserved. Although in the beginning they were probably made out of wood and then changed into stone capitals later. And it seems to be our first what's called a dipteros, meaning there would have been 2 rows of columns going around. But anyway, it's longer than it is wide, like most temples, but especially long and thin, and has sort of a wide central opening. A slightly later version of Ionic temple, which is very famous, is the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. If you go there nowadays, there's one and only one column left. But in antiquity, we know that it really was like a forest of columns, multiple rows of columns going around a cella, which is sort of the square or the rectangular bit on the inside where the god was actually worshipped. This is a reconstruction of a later Temple of Artemis, but there were 2 or 3 different temples of Artemis over time from the 6th century, and the original one was said to have been one of the wonders of the ancient world. And another early precursor is from the beginning of the 6th century BC, a painted limestone temple it's sometimes associated with Artemis, probably Artemis at Corfu or Corcyra, and it actually has sculpted pediments. That's the triangular part at the 2 ends, because it's kind of a flat end with a triangular roof on top, right? And so you have this open end, and we have many fancy Georgian buildings, for example, in the British Museum in London that have pediments in them like this, kind of following the Greek precedent. But in this case, the pediment at the front and the pediment at the back showed almost the same figures. And we also have an interesting literary text of the poet Pindar in his Olympian Ode 13 tells us about how the pediment was invented at Corinth. Now, this isn't at Corinth, but Corfu was a colony of Corinth at the time, so it's kind of true in that sense. It seems to be our first one. And it's also interesting because we have Medusa. Everyone loves Medusa. She's the one who turns you to stone when she looks at you. And so she's going to really freak everyone out as she's staring you, in the face as you approach the temple, and really fill you with fear of the gods. Kind of seemed to be the way they did it in the olden days in Greece. And that's what we call apotropaic. Also, she's staring you in the face in the same way you use an evil eye to sort of turn away evil, avert evil. But it's also interesting because you've got, non-narrative elements and myths happening at different times. It's kind of a story for another day, but just giving you an idea that there are precedents. And that was a Doric order temple on the mainland in Greece, and also, in the Peloponnese, where Olympia is. We've got a little bit before the Parthenon, the canonical temple in the Doric style, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. And this is actually a false reconstruction. It's famous for its metopes, which you see in the museum nowadays, but those metopes would have been on the front porch. So just inside the temple, once you went through the columns and looked up to the top of the columns entering to the cella, you would see 6 metopes on this side, 6 on the other side. 6 plus 6 equals 12. And indeed, they're decorated with the 12 labors of Heracles, who's the son of Zeus. And this is a top view of the plan of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, which we know was built by a local architect called Libon. Well, Elis is nearby, but it's built of totally rational proportions. To understand that, you might want to talk to your maths teachers or something like that. But and canonical, as in once this temple was built and the architects decided this is the way to do it, this is kind of how they did it for all time. So it's 13 columns down the side and 6 at the front and 6 at the back. And actually the Parthenon's bigger than that in different proportions, but that's one thing that tells us that the Parthenon's different, not your normal Greek temple. But as I say, the Temple of Zeus is famous for its metopes. And there's Heracles with Athena, his helpmate, actually cleaning out the stables of Aegeus. That's a local myth. And then, as I say, there are 12 of the myths, and it's him beating all of these enemies. The only mortal there who isn't an enemy is King Eurystheus. He's the one cowering away in a Pythos jar here, a big jar, because Heracles has brought the Erymanthian boar back to him. And Eurystheus is important because Heracles basically is enslaved to Eurystheus for a year or so to go off and do all of these labors. And we have Homer in the Iliad talks about that too. But if we go back to the Parthenon, it's dedicated to Athena Parthenos in 438 at the Great Panathenaia. And we know the names of its architects, Ictinus and Callicrates, who were Athenians. And as I say, it's larger than normal. It's 8 by 17 columns with Ionic details inside. And it's built of a local marble, but it turns out to be the best marble in the world, both for architecture and it's very fine grained, so it's good for making the sculptures. And Phidias, and I mentioned him earlier, he's the one who did the statue of Athena Promachos. He was the episkopos, which means essentially manager, artistic manager. And this is the plan, as you can see. And what's going on here is it's a Doric temple from the outside. So these are all Doric columns around. But then on the inside here, and at the front and at the back porch, these are Ionic columns and also Ionic columns inside. So basically Doric on the outside and Ionic in the inside. And that also gives the sculptors a chance to have both Doric and Ionic sculptural elements. So the Doric frieze on the outside and the Ionic frieze on the inside, where it's slightly covered by the shade, but if you look up at the right angle, you can see it too. And so we've got the metopes, the square panels are the first part put in. And if you think about how you're going to build a building, you kind of want to put them on before you put the roof on. Then they put the Ionic frieze on the inside, a little bit later. And then they put the pediments on as they were building the roof. And then the last thing they did is they put the statue of Athena Parthenos inside. And we know that was after 438, and we've seen her already. And this is a very handy drawing that gives you basically a description of what's going on here. So if you go to the southwest side, this is where the procession starts, and it goes both directions. And we have people on horseback, riders, all the way along. And then finally on the south side, we get the chariot races, and then old men, tablet bearers, the cattle being sacrificed. Remember the 100 oxen I talked about. I'll get back to the east end again. And then we go the other direction after the riders, chariot, old men, musicians, people carrying hydriae, which are water things, tray bearers, more sacrifice. So it's pretty much all military stuff, training, sacrificial stuff. And then at the front, we've got that image of the girls and the man with the folded peplos. And then in the middle of it all, the gods. And this is where we've got the humans and the gods and some heroes in between, all mixed up. So that's all really very interesting. And it's kind of unique, a first, to have the gods and the humans pretty much in the same space, imagined to be in the same space. And just some quick views of those particular images on the south side. These are the earliest ones to be done. This is where we have the story of the Centauronike, the Greeks fighting the centaurs, who are actually from a little bit north of Athens. They live around Mount Pelion and everything, but there's basically they came to a wedding of Pirithous, who was the local king, They were invited because they were guests and they were neighbors and everything, but then they got drunk and they started, carrying off the women and breaking the pots and being a mess. And so the Greeks like to emphasize the story about how the Greeks are better, shall we say, than the centaurs because they behave themselves. I don't know if that was always the case, but anyway, on the west side, we've got these images of these women on horseback, and that turns out to be the Amazons. And again, the Greeks like to emphasize this, that they beat the Amazons because they were these really strong women who were kind of unlike the women that the Greek knew because they were in charge. They would go racing, they would do the hunting, they would do everything on horseback. Another one of their great battles was when they fought in the Iliad. They fought the Trojans and the fall of Troy. And so the fall of Troy goes all the way down the north side, decorating the metopes. They're not in very good shape, but enough work has been done on that. We know what's what. And finally, a battle not between the Greeks and their enemy, but the gods and the giants at the front end. And that's the east end. And that kind of makes sense because you're looking towards the gods maybe that way. And so, as I say, we've got these 4 different elements, if you include also the chryselephantine statue of Athena. I've shown you that already, the plan. But if we look at what the frieze itself is representing, and this is where I said there's lots of horses, there's some sacrificial stuff going on. Well, if we look back, and this is my professor, Jerry Pollitt, actually wrote an article on this, at least 20 years ago, that basically what it's doing is it's emphasizing athletic things, the agones, or the athletic contests the Athenians have, and remember they have it in the Panathenaia, military training, and remember the aspect of jumping on and off of the chariot, the apobates, and also sacrifices. And these are 3 things that the Athenians are really, really good at, and Thucydides has recorded the great statesman Pericles' funeral speech in book 2 and emphasizes these 3 things, and that's exactly what's shown on the Parthenon frieze. So we've got the apobates again. See that chariot racer jumping up and down off the chariot. We've got plenty of military training, all these horsemen. We've got sacrifices, all the oxen going to sacrifice. So that seems to me a better explanation for what's going on there than the traditional idea that we have the Panathenaic festival, because we have so many other, yes, references to things like the Panathenaia, but not the procession alone, not just, and not all the procession, not all the stuff that the literary sources tell us were part of the procession. But then the East frieze, where we have the assembly of the gods, is a completely different kettle of fish. And lots of work, Jennifer Niles and others have worked on identifying who these gods are. This is a nicely painted reconstruction of it, and a good reminder that much of this was decorated. It was marble, but it was also painted. Some people say they don't like Greek art because there's no color. Well, the color was there. It's just gone away over time. And you could play a game, trying to identify those gods yourself. But let's say Poseidon here, he's got his trident, and he's the god of the sea. So that's an important element for him. But then, as I say, and I mentioned this earlier, we've got what seems to be the important thing that happened once every 4 years, the presentation of Athena's peplos, the garment at the great Panathenaia. And that's the best link to the Panathenaia and the Parthenon itself. So sorry about the slight interruption, but I think we got through all of my slides there, and I'd be happy to turn them off, well, unless I need them, and go back to, you just seem boring old me.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting, and especially your take on the frieze there towards the end as well, which is another approach that we haven't considered but certainly will do together now in class about the military training and the apobate. So thank you very much for that. And we have got time, just probably 5 minutes for questions. Is there anything anyone would like to know? Richard?
Yeah, fine. You say
Right, okay, so you're interested in the translation. I've got a student asking about the epithet promakos,
Yes.
being ready for war. I think, is it because you've translated it as frontline fighter? You just...
Yeah.
You can't...
It's a good question.
Okay, right. He's just saying he hasn't found anything about the epithet meaning ready for war.
It's, well, I could look up my sources on that one, but it depends on how you define pro. And so makos, we agree on that. That's all about war. And it's true that sometimes a fighter is called pro if they're at the front, ahead, shall we say. But pro is a little bit of ahead. And so the ready for war is in the sense of pro being like ahead of the war. You know, what do you do ahead of the war? You get ready. And so in a way, we're kind of agreeing with each other, but it's just a matter of if you're ready enough to be in the front line, or if you're ready enough to be ready just in case the war comes. And I think we'd agree that, well, Athena might not have been in the front line, but she was definitely showing them that she was ready. So in that sense, she's a little bit before the action. But I mean, she's a goddess, so maybe she could be in the front more and she just would never get killed because she's immortal. But yeah, it's a good question, and I think both translations work.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, Keris. Oh, what a lovely question. So Keris has said, you previously mentioned at the beginning of the talk that Athena was your favorite goddess. Is there a particular myth that has inspired this love for her?
Oh no, I think there's no particular thing. It's just because she's a good all-rounder. I mean, any obviously I like brainy goddesses because I've done a lot of study and I teach. And so she's a goddess of wisdom, so that's important. And that fits in beautifully with the story about how she was born. And we've got pictures of this on pots and whatever. And even on the Parthenon, if you look at the excuse me, pediments, which I didn't show you, basically she was born crack of dawn, fully armed, out of the head of her father Zeus. And it was because he was told that he was going to have a child who was going to be more powerful than him, and so he swallowed her. And then she couldn't help but be born because she was just so powerful. And so she just, Hephaestus had, he was the god of smithing. So he had his little hatchet. So he came along with his hatchet, and he, you know, basically put a hole in Zeus's head, and Athena popped out, fully armed, ready for war, promachos. And that's just really, really cool. And just on a personal element, my daughter is called Sophia, which means wisdom, of course. And wisdom is part of Athena, and Athena being the goddess of wisdom. I hadn't quite planned it this way. Sophia did her own thing, but she was born at dawn too. So just like Athena. So it was a little bit like she had been named for Athena. So that kind of helps solidify that she's my favorite.
Definitely, I think that's a great reason to be. What a lovely name as well. Well, we are at 1:15, and I know students need to be at next lesson, but I just want to say thank you again so much. It was incredibly useful, and it will be so useful to also play the recording back, and for many people, I'm sure, that will watch this remotely as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. We do appreciate it.
And enjoy the rest of your day. And sorry I
Thank
couldn't be
you.
with you.
Not at all. I know we could distance, but it's the great thing about online learning now. So yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.